Guten Morgen. Hi. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie recht herzlich hier im Burgtheater heute Vormittag begrüßen. Wir alle sind in großartiger Erwartung, ob es denn nun Koalitionsverhandlungen geben wird oder nicht. Sollte sich im Laufe des Tages entscheiden. Wer hätte das gedacht vor 4 oder 5 Jahren, dass wir einen grünen Präsidenten und die Grünen in der Bundesregierung haben. Man sieht, wie schnell sich die Sachen ändern können. Und man sieht auch, dass die Dinge nicht in Demokratien nie festgeschraubt sind. Da gibt es nie ein endgültiges. Es gibt nie etwas, was fix ist oder was gemauert ist, außer jene Sätze, die in unserer Bundesverfassung stehen. Und ich glaube, das ist ein gutes Zeichen auch für die Diskussion heute, dass die Dinge in Entwicklung sind. Ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen. Mein Name ist Boris Marte, ich bin von der Erste Stiftung und wir sind sehr glücklich, dass wir mit dieser Viererbande, nämlich der Stiftung, dem Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen, der Standard und dem Burgtheater diese Diskussion, die hier am Sonntagvormittag stattfindet, gemeinsam organisieren dürfen. Es ist eine Partnerschaft, die jetzt schon über mehrere Jahre hält und das ist gut so. Und wir haben alle gelesen, dass das Burgtheater hier sich auch neu aufstellt in der Art und Weise, wie sie diese Diskurse in Zukunft führen will. Und das freut uns auch, weil wir sehr davon überzeugt sind, dass das was Gutes ist, was wir hier gemeinsam machen. Heute Abend sehen Sie hier die Backchen. Ich weiß nicht, wer es von Ihnen schon gesehen hat. Ein ziemlich gewaltiges Stück, das vor allem von einem Chor, also das ganze Stück wird von einem Chor gegeben. Also ich bin sehr gespannt, ob das hier eine Diskussion oder ein Chor wird. Also, ich glaube schon, wenn man in die Liste der Namen und Persönlichkeiten hineinschaut, die heute hier auftreten, dann hat das Potenzial. Ich glaube nicht, dass sie sozusagen auf einem Fließband auftreten werden heute hier am Vormittag, aber dass sie uns einführen werden in ein Thema, das uns alle natürlich beschäftigt. Wohin geht dieser Kontinent und ist dieser Kontinent fähig, sich selbst zu erneuern und die Herausforderungen, die die Welt an uns stellt, auch bearbeiten kann. Klimaschutz etc. Also wir wissen alle, dass wir nur als gemeinsames Europa gewisse Themen bewältigen können. Wir werden sehen, ob aus dem Europa der Nationen etwas wachsen kann. Insofern freuen wir uns auf die heutige Diskussion und ich darf die Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer auf die Bühne bitten. Herzlichen Dank und viel Spaß.
Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for being here on a Sunday morning. We know that you could have spent your time otherwise, but to come to the Burgtheater to listen to another one of our debating Europes is a real honor and privilege for us all. My name is Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna, and we are one of the partners, as you heard from Boris Marte, with their Standard, the Burgtheater, and the Erste Stiftung. Today is a big day because it's the day after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or more precisely, the destruction of that wall by the people. Last night, 30 years ago, those of us who are old enough lived through a deeply historical moment that brought a lot of hope, a lot of passion, something that was unexpected for many, namely the fall of communism that was actually not predicted. It is the result of a successive number of steps and historical moves in a variety of countries. We won't go into that history today, but I think it's also important, and this is part of the discussion that we've had over the years. It's also the last night was Kristallnacht in 1938, 81 years ago. And I think that juxtaposing these huge moments of hope, such as 1989, and these darkest of moments of European history in the middle of this continent that has such a long and wonderful history of culture and of upbeat, emancipatory moments, to know that we can sink so deeply into violence is deeply disturbing to all of us. And some of the dynamics that we're seeing over the past decade, the rise of the far right, the rise of populism, is something that worries many of us, while at the same time, and I'm one of those who purport to say that it is not all doom and gloom, because we have also some very good developments in a variety of these countries. Even having said that, I think we need to reflect on these issues, and that is the purpose of these debates, to help us understand, as Hannah Arendt so often said in her work, we need to understand before we can act, so as that we can act appropriately. And to do that today, we have a really wonderful lineup of speakers. Some of you know them and have heard them before, but let me briefly introduce you to them. To my right is Professor Ruth Wodak, who's here, a Viennese. She's a fellow currently also at the Institute for Human Sciences, but she is an Austrian linguist. She has taught at the University of Lancaster in Great Britain for a number of years, is the recipient of a number of distinguished awards here in Austria and in other places, most notably the Wittgenstein Prize. And in October 2006, you were awarded, Ruth, the Women's Prize of the City of Vienna. So somebody who's really here, and is the author, needless to say, of many books. I'll just mention two: The Politics of Fear in 2015, What Right-Wing Populist Discourses Mean, and then just very recently an edited volume called Europe at a Crossroads, Confronting Populist and Nationalist Challenge, as if she knew that she was going to speak on this panel. Please welcome Professor Ruth Wodak.
Thank you.
To my right is Dr. Constanze Itzel. Constanze is the director of the recently created Museum of European History in Brussels, called the House of European History. I guess many of you don't know about it. I didn't know about it until recently. I haven't been to the museum, but at my next trip, I will definitely come, Constanze, and visit you. Constanze is a German art historian and historian, has worked in many institutions pertaining to the culture and art history. She has a doctorate in that field. And from 2017, the moment of the birth of the museum, she moved from Germany to Brussels. Please welcome Director Constanze Itzel. Next is Professor and Dr. Jacques Rupnik, who was born in Prague, roughly around the time I was, in a different place. And we actually both studied together in France at Sciences Po. Jacques works at Sciences Po. He is a research director at the Center for International Studies. He is somebody who crosses the divide of East and West Europe. He lives in Paris. Most notably, he was a senior foreign policy advisor to President Václav Havel in the early days after the fall of the wall in '89, and then after President Havel left office, he remained very close to him and worked with him. Jacques is the author of many a book. He teaches in the United States. He teaches at the Collège d'Europe in Bruges. His latest book is actually published in Italy. It will come out in French very soon, Europe Without the Wall. Please welcome Jacques Rupnik. Last but not least, Ivan Krastev, who is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences and is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and founder of that center in Sofia, Bulgaria, also living in Europe for many of these years. He has been the executive director of an international commission on the Balkans that was chaired by the former president of Germany, von Weizsäcker, and Giuliano Amato, is the author of a number of books, In Trust We Mistrust, about democracy, about this democracy disrupted after Europe, his very well-known book, Europa Dämmerung, I believe, in German, and very recently published both in English and German and many other languages, a book called The Light That Failed, that looks at 1989, what happened and what went wrong, to put it simply, but we'll get back to those issues. Please welcome Ivan Krastev. And Ivan rightly nodded at me because there was an international commission on the Balkans before that, of which Jacques Rupnik was the international executive secretary. That report was called Unfinished Peace in the Balkans.
What a memory.
Yeah. So there have been many commissions, but we still have a few challenges in the Balkans, but we might get to that as well. Let me start with you, Ruth. And if I may share, last night we had dinner with some of the panelists, and we were talking about the night of the 9th of November of '89, but also Kristallnacht, and you mentioned that on that night, 81 years ago, the synagogue of your grandfather, where he was rabbi, was burnt down here in Vienna in Humboldtplatz, and that there is, as of 2 years ago, 2017, a commemorative plaque remembering that night. So again, we are constantly buffeted, those of us who think about Europe, but also of our nation states, between these two extremes. And let me say also, as you know, there's been this and continuing discussion, we are from nowhere or we are from somewhere. And if I can put it a bit simply and bluntly, we are both. And even if we are just from somewhere, that somewhere has so many layers and levels. We are here in Vienna, we are European, we are from our respective countries and from our respective family backgrounds. From your vantage point, Ruth, and you have been looking at these questions and you've written a number of books, how do you see this dichotomy, or how do you live it also from a personal point of view, this distinction between somewhere nowhere, between Europe and being from your family, being from Vienna, but also having lived abroad? Is the nation state threatening this broader identity that we have?
Well, this is a, of course, difficult question. I think that this dichotomy doesn't really exist in that way. I think that we have always been balancing between different identities, different locations where we live, different belongings, and sort of, I don't see that we have to decide if there is sort of this European identity, if there are local, regional, or national identities. I think there's a big tension which exists between these various identities, and it depends a lot on various ideologies, how they are played out. And in preparing for our discussion today, I looked, because we had once been studying various speeches of prominent European politicians in the year 2000, which was kind of the millennium. Everybody, all the big politicians were talking about the new visions for the 21st century. And so there was a very famous speech by Joschka Fischer, the so-called Humboldt speech, where he gave a vision about what Europe should be and where it should go. Basically, very strongly a constitutional federation. No big debate about values, because for the Germans that was still negatively connotated. And then there were French speakers, Jospin and others, and of course Tony Blair, and they were completely different ideas. Yeah, so the meaning-making of Europe was completely different. And there was this French idea, I mean, of course not all French, but of le projet. Yeah? So Europe was an unfinished project, an adventure, where, you know, nobody knows where it will go, but we are all on the boat, which was very different from the German. And the British, somehow Blair had to explain to the British what Europe was actually about. Because, you know, there was this channel, and when I lived in Britain, people always said, well, where are you going now? And I said I was going home, and they said, you're going overseas. Now, overseas was the continent. It wasn't the Atlantic or something, but that's how it was expressed. So it was far away, yeah? And that's not very surprising, the situation we have now. And if I look at speeches now, and we've, again, done a huge study of European and national identities in a longitudinal way, if we look at that now, we have a very polarized situation. And I would just like to juxtapose Orban and Macron, who basically gave speeches also almost on the same day. For example, the speech on the Karlspreis, when Macron received that award and Orban inaugurated his new government. And we have not just national visions, we have two visions about Europe, about democracy, about the future. And on the one hand, we have, as you said, we belong here. It's inward-looking, it's exclusive. And on the other hand, it's inclusive and outward-looking. And I think this is the big dichotomy which we're faced with right now. Not, are there nation states, are there no nation? Of course there are nation states, and they will remain. Yeah? But the question is, how do we define national identity? And do we have an inclusive vision? That means people who live here, migrants, for example, also, people with different citizenships, different histories, different languages. I would like to stress, of course, multilingualism. Or are we living somewhere with one language, one heritage, still going back to some kind of Blut und Boden, yeah, very nativist, exclusive. And this is, I think, the big divide which we currently experience. And because you started out with asking me also about my own biography, that is like turning the clock back for me. Yeah? So, of course, I grew up with the history of my parents, with trauma, and this idea of being excluded because you are different in some ways, religiously, culturally, obviously at that time racist, yeah, imposed. It seems to me that there is a direction which is really trying to turn the clock back. It has many reasons. I've read Ivan's books, and I know what you think. But for me, this is frightening.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth. Let me turn to you, Constanze. If you allow, you are of a younger generation. You are from Germany. You are a historian. So if you can take us into a bit of historical depth, not the rest of us are without it, but this is your profession, and you are leading an institution that looks at the history of Europe. It must be challenging in many ways, but the question is, and I was just reading a very good article by Krzysztof Pomian, a Polish historian, in a recent article in the French journal Le Débat. He talks about what characterizes Europeans. When a European goes to China or to Latin America, you suddenly realize, well, you eat certain food, you kind of have certain habits in daily life. And that means that this history of a European characteristic is long and deep. The cultural identity is deep. But this identity has been forged through the nation state in its various guises. How do you reconcile or not these things, and how does your museum present this? And if I can add also, if you can add a personal moment to this, what was for you the events that shaped these 30 years that we're in now?
Okay, so first of all, thanks for having invited me. I represent a museum which tries to show the history of Europe from a European perspective, so to complement the national museums, the local and regional history museums. And so we have tried to come up with a narrative, first of all, to define what Europe is. Can it be defined? Can it be clearly delimited? And we show 19th and 20th century history, and one of the things we look at is the history of the nation states, which is actually quite a recent history. The way we look at it today, the nation state as being defined ethnically or culturally or linked to a certain territory, is actually around not more than 220 years old, but it is a European history. So what I would like to answer to your question is, yes, Europe has been defined by national identities, but also if you go further back, by other allegiances, by a lot of centuries of cooperation and contact through wars, centuries of cooperation and commerce. So it has been shaped also by these interactions and not only substantially by the national identities. So I think that what we should learn from history is that no political model, be it the nation state or any other, the empires or any other kind of political entity, has an essence in itself and pre-existed. They are all constructions, and this is what we try to show in our exhibition, that what we decide to build as a political entity can be looked at as a construction, and so every time period needs to come up with the models it needs for its challenges. And here I would like to answer also to what Ruth has said, that I think we shouldn't put up the nation against Europe, because we will always need, in my view, multi-level governance. We always have, and we don't even question that, city governments coexisting with national governments or regional governments in some countries, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And the same goes for identities, as you rightly said. There's a family identity. Every one of us has one, I think, or several, and there can be a local one, there can be a European one, and they coexist. So I don't think we should put the history of nation states is a European phenomenon. So European history and national history are one and the same in a sense. But one plea I would like to make that I've been thinking about for a long time is, why do we always have to speak about bounded entities? Because it occurs to me that current challenges, that global challenges that we all face, are often presented as models of flows or connectedness, models, so climate change, migration flows across borders, digital connections between data flows, etc. But we are used to looking at history or at the current situation by our maps made of own little boxes, national boxes or local boxes. Should we not change the paradigm a little bit and speak more about connectedness, interactions, data flows, people flows? Because this is a normal component in human history. So I think we should sometimes also, even in this setting, we should get away from, confronting boxes like national, European labeling, but look more at interconnectedness between all those levels.
I think we would, most of us would agree with you, but as the saying goes, all politics is local, and politicians need to be elected on something, and thus they stick to the national framework and use actually the outside as a bashing ball. Brussels is responsible for everything, to put it very simply, or some other places. And I think, and we may touch upon Brexit at some moment, but definitely we have a problem there, even though I think all of us here would realize that the interconnectedness is very, very clear and strong. Jacques, as I said, as many of us, but you practically more than others, straddled these two sides of Europe, what used to be called and what we're very much against saying the old and the new Europe. And the fact that these countries, the slogans of '89 were freedom and democracy and return to Europe. There was this wish to actually overcome what had happened at Yalta and Potsdam when Europe was divided into spheres of influence. And finally, that divide disappeared and people could be reintegrated into Europe. And there was this really miracle, the annus mirabilis moment. What is it today, in your view, that we have this return, we call it with various ways, renationalization of politics, the self-serving interest of politicians who say, well, actually, we need to focus much more on ourselves and we don't want to have the view from Brussels really overpowering our national interests and politics?
Yes. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this discussion. Yes, it is a striking contrast to see, the situation 30 years ago, the wall comes down, and you have, in the whole of East Central Europe, aspiration to democracy, popular sovereignty, national sovereignty recovering after the coming out of the Soviet Empire, recovering the national sovereignty, and the slogan of '89 was returning to Europe. So the three things were seen as complementary. They were the same thing. So there was no divide at the time over that issue. So if we take it, of course, from today's perspective, we see this very strong opposition in some circles between these three elements. You would reject the European constrain the European rule of law in the name of popular sovereignty. You've been elected, you have a two-thirds majority in parliament. Why should you be taking calls from Brussels in the name of some norms that were adopted by a body of 28 countries? So that is, of course, a very striking paradox. And you even turn Europe, Brussels, into the bogeyman. I mean, being in Budapest last year for the election campaign, to see posters, stop Brussels. This is the poster for the campaign. So that, just symbolically gives you how far we have traveled. Of course, that didn't happen overnight. I remember already in the 1990s. This was exactly 20 years ago. A dichotomy that I borrow from the Czech case, which I know, but you would find equivalents elsewhere. Václav Klaus used this formula. He was then prime minister to become president later, and he would say, are we going to dissolve our sovereignty and our identity in the European Union as a lump of sugar in a cup of coffee? So that was his version of it. So already then you had this feeling. And Havel answered that. He said, I don't understand this. I'm from Prague, I'm Czech, I'm European. These are three dimensions of who I am and who we are, and they are interdependent, interlocking. I cannot sing a single one of them, of the three, without the others. So you had there already then, the two views were there, except that the second view had prevailed in the phase of what was called the Great Transformation, the accession to the European Union. But it's not like the other one was not already present in some other form. And so what we've had in recent years is a kind of post-crisis, post-accession, whatever, backlash against that first view that prevailed, that your democracy, your future in the European Union are the same thing. And we have now sort of a bunch of sovereignist power arguing identity and sovereignty. In the Klaus quote that I just gave, are we going to let our sovereignty and our identity? Sovereignty we should debate. It's a legitimate debate about sovereignty. You know, this is the oldest foundation of democracy. Democracy, after all, historically has been born in the framework of the nation state. It is perfectly legitimate to raise the question of sovereignty and how much sovereignty, what is this notion of shared sovereignty that the European Union represents? It's the slip from sovereignty to identity. So suddenly you have this, you are in defensive mode. We protect our identity, which is threatened allegedly by this European cup of coffee in which we're going to dissolve. And sovereignty we have to defend because that's the way to protect our identity. And that's the basic of that discourse, which I identified with Václav Klaus because I just didn't want to go to the obvious, which you can see with Kaczynski, with Orban, and many, many others. They are just simply the two most obvious. I think that to go back to the question of nation state and Europe, that has been there from the beginning of the European project. I don't want to go too much into that now, but you had that dilemma there after the war. You had two views. You had the federalists who thought the nation state had been responsible for 2 world wars. A nation state was the enemy. So, I mean, the enemy. You had to deal with nation states, but basically that was, you had to contain it. You had to make sure that we don't get back into the confrontations that had destroyed Europe in the first half of the 20th century. So that was the, let's say, the impulse of the founding fathers, the federalist impulse, if you want. And then you had the other view that General de Gaulle represented, and that was the idea of the Europe of nations. So not the federalist thing, it was alliances of intergovernmental. That was more his approach. And the two coexisted. It's not that just one imposed on the other. The two, of course, coexisted. And the philosophy of the founding fathers is if you build this interdependence economically, through society, through culture, etc., eventually you will overcome some of the inhibitions about sharing sovereignty. Well, we're now discovering this is not exactly the case. And just to conclude, in these two views of what Europe and the nation state should look like, Jacques Delors, when he was president of the Commission, he was asked about that, and he proposed as formula, Europe should be a federation of nation states. Well, that's a great formula. It's a great cop-out as well, because the federalists here, oh, federation, good. And nation state want to present, they say, oh yeah, they feel reassured because we have federation of nation states. My final word would be, in this debate, you will not persuade people by simply giving a vision of Europe that is purely normative, procedural, institutional. If you have that competition between nationalism, which is a very strongly emotional and mobilizing force, and the procedural, guess who is winning? So I don't think that it will be enough to do this kind of thing. You know, in the Dictionnaire des idées reçues de Flaubert, he has under the heading flag, which makes your heart beat, you know, which accelerates your heartbeat. Well, nobody would say about the European flag that it accelerates your heartbeat, no. Except the enemies of Europe, those who don't like Europe. Yeah, they get excited. Their heartbeat gets accelerated. So I don't think you win the argument by simply saying, let's have constitutional patriotism, let's have no... That is not enough. What you have to show is that the nation state is incapable of facing the challenges that we are confronted with today. I will not spell them, all of them, but I mean, take globalization and the economic dimension, take migrations and the way of facing, take our surroundings, the environment of the European Union. We have the Ukrainian crisis and Putin in the east. We have the Islamists in the south, and we have Trump in the White House. If this is not the moment when Europeans discover that they have a common challenge or a common destiny, well, then when? And I'm not saying that to have an adversary or an adverse situation is enough to bring us all together, but it certainly should be enough to get over the delusions that any nation states, even the bigger ones in the EU, are capable of facing those challenges.
Thank you, Jacques. I cannot... You have raised many issues, as have Ruth and Constanze, and we'll come back to a number of them. You mentioned the coffee of Václav Klaus, which reminds me of the famous definition that George Steiner gave of Europe. He said it's coffee shops. And by that, of course, he meant this very big understanding of Europe as the place of free speech, of discussion, of understanding, of friendship, of solidarity, but also of passionate discussions of what actually is Europe and what is the nation state. Ivan, the light that failed, if I can put it simply, how is it related to this relationship between the nation state and Europe?
So in 1990s, just after the end of the Cold War, there was a vice president of the United States, Dan Quayle, who was not famous for being part of the Burgtheater debates, and he made the following quote. He wanted to say the world will be better tomorrow, but he said the future will be better tomorrow. And in a certain way, if you go back, in a certain way, the future was better yesterday. Because if you try to imagine how the world was looking like then from 1989, there was incredible expectations on both East and West. And it's quite important, in my view, to go back and to try to see what was the nature of the expectations, what worked, what didn't work, because many of the problems that we have today are not of the results of things that has failed, but also the thing that has worked. And I'll start with something very simple. 1989 is very important, but it has different faces in different places. Let's go with 3 1989s, which are very important for different political actors on the global scene today, but they're very different. 1989 for us is the end of communism, basically the return of Europe as a geopolitical player, and the rise of the liberal democracy as the end of history. Go back to China, they also have their 1989, and the message is the end of communism was not the end of the power of the Communist Party. And then you go to the radical Islam, and they're going to say 1989 was the year in which the radical Islam defeated one of the superpowers. For them, the important story about 1989 was the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, where they believe that they have won. And I'm saying this because, paradoxically, the world that we see today is the result of kind of different legacies of 1989. And before going exactly to the nationalism story, I want to make 2 points which was quite important for us with Stephen Holmes when we were working on the book. One is that the biggest illusion of 1989 was that the East is going to change, but the West is going to remain the same. That's not possible. The change of the East was also the change of the West. And it was quite important to see to what extent that the liberal democracy, what we knew it, was very much preconditioned on the Cold War. And the second thing which was quite important, in my view, was exactly the certain type of misinterpretation, particularly of the 1990s. And I do believe that in order to understand what is happening now, we should go back then. First of all, everybody is saying that there was a triumphalism in 1989. It's not exactly the case. I see Mr. Busek here and others who have been in power in this moment. In a certain way, it was a time of great anxiety. If you're going to see the most popular titles of this period, there was Out of Control. It was Brzezinski's title. There was the idea, the Barbarian Sentiment. And this was very much the fear that in 1989, 1990, the fear was that communism is going to be replaced by nationalistic regimes. An old Soviet joke has captured this better than any political commentator could do. And the joke is the following. A Soviet Jewish family, it's 1990 or 1991, are going to Israel, they're crossing the border, and the Soviet guard asked them, "But comrade, why are you leaving Soviet Union?" And the Jew said, I have 2 reasons for this. He said, okay, give me the reasons. And the Jew said, listen, Soviet Union is a communist country, and we Jews have some problems with communism, so. And then the guard said, but communism is going to be over. And the guy said, and this is the second reason. I'm saying this because one of the interesting differences between 1945 and 1989 was that if in 1945 there was a general consensus that nationalism was very much responsible for what happened, and nationalism all over Europe has been defeated in a different way, not just in Germany. Tony Judd is making very strongly the point that European Union was founded by the country who lost the war. The only European democracy that survived, the United Kingdom, were not part of it. In 1989, this was not the case. The nationalist was part of the victorious coalition against communism. There was a very strong nationalistic wing in the Solidarity movement. So from this point of view, when we talk about Mr. Kaczynski did not change his mind. In a certain way, where he was in 1989, he's now. And this, with Mr. Orban, it's slightly more complicated. But why I'm saying this? Because nationalism was an extremely important factor in the success of the anti-communist oppositions on the first elections. The only country in which the ex-communist party won the elections was my own country, Bulgaria. And one of the reasons was that the Bulgarian nationalism in 1990 was very much not anti-Soviet but anti-Turkish because of the renaming and the expulsion of the Bulgarian Turks in the late 1980s. So basically they managed to mobilize the nationalistic sentiment. I'm saying this because from this point of view, the interesting question about Central and Eastern Europe is not why the nationalism emerged. The problem is where it has been hiding for 10 or 15 years. And here I have 2 explanations why basically, starting with the mid-1990s till basically the mid-2000s, basically the nationalism as if has disappeared. One is the effect of the Yugoslav wars. There is a strange tendency for people when they comment Yugoslav wars and when they comment Central and East European transitions to keep them as if they have been taking part in a parallel worlds. But they have been strongly influencing each other. The bloody face of nationalism that came with the Yugoslav wars was one of the reasons. Basically, the nationalism was perceived as dangerous and very much shaped the way people have been talking. But the second was that for many of the anti-communist nationalism, the association of the nationalism with the ex-communists in the face of Milosevic was also that making them muted. And we have this period in which, for different geopolitical reasons, getting out of the Russian sphere of influence, the idea to join the European Union and so on, the nationalistic discourse declined. But to be honest, the nationalistic sentiment was quite much there if you go basically on the surveys. What is interesting for me in this debate is that we have a nationalism in Europe today which is on the rise, but this is not a nationalism that believes in the nation state. And this is what Jacques is saying. Paradoxically, if you go and see the opinion polls, it is not that people believe that European Union does not work, but the nation state does work. The feeling is that nothing works. So this is also strange nationalism, which is totally deprived of a national economy. People talk about nationalism in the 19th century was very much about national economy, it was about territory and so on. If you go, for example, back to the Hungarian economy, you're going to see that 30% of the industrial production is coming from several German companies. So from this point of view, this is a strange story in which nationalism very much moved from the sphere of economy and basically territory and strategy exactly to the problem of identity, to the nationalist feeling, and very much based on the idea of nationalism perceived as ethnic nationalism. And this is the last 2 points I want to do. In Central and Eastern Europe, it has a lot to do with 2 factors which we don't discuss quite often. One is the effect of ethnic homogenization that took place in the region during the 20th century. I just ask you to imagine the ethnic maps of Europe in the year 1900 and today. And in 1900, you're going to see two Europes. One was very much ethnically homogeneous, and this was Western Europe, Germany, France. The other was much more ethnically and culturally diverse, and this was the Habsburg Europe. And then basically you have a century of two wars, of the destruction of people, of a major expulsion and exchange of populations, and today if you see at the ethnic map, you're going to see two Europe again. One is very much ethnically and culturally diverse, and this is Western Europe. And the other is very much ethnically homogeneous, and this is Central and Eastern Europe. And to be fair, it was not the Central and East Europeans who did it. It was very much done by them. There was the destruction of the Jews, there was the expulsions of the Germans, this was the expulsions of the Ukrainians and others. Why I'm saying this ethnic homogeneity is a critical factor, because in Central and Eastern Europe, this is very much accompanied by a major population decline. Central and Eastern Europe is the part of the world that is shrinking most dramatically in demographic terms. For the 30 years of transition, basically, Eastern Europe lost 18 million people. So this fear of aging, out-migration, and the world becoming bigger and bigger created preconditions for this type of a totally defensive and exclusive majoritarian cultural nationalism, which is very different than the nationalism that you know from the beginning of the 20th century, which was paradoxically much more universalist and much more political in its nature. My last point is going back to the 1989. There is a famous Bulgarian fiction writer, Georgi Gospodinov, who is now working on a novel, and he was telling part of the novel which pushed me to think about something. His novel is very much based on the fact that now if you go opinion polls, 67% of the Europeans believe that life was better before. But we don't know when before. So he's trying to imagine that European leaders meet, and because they don't have to agree, they cannot agree on a common idea for the future of Europe, they decided that they should agree where Europe should go back, which is the year in which we want to go back in order to be happy. And I was start to thinking about 20th century, which is this, is there this single year in which German, Poles, Bulgarians, Austrians, Spaniards can go together? And I was going back and back, and paradoxically there is only 1 year on which we can agree. And this was 1989, because this was the year in which the expectations were highest. Not the incomes, the expectations of the people. And from this point of view, the biggest problem which I see with the European project at this moment is that the European Union after World War II was founded by societies that were feared the past, because the past was war and destruction, but they were hopeful about the future. And this is why you can construct identities based on the future. Now we have societies which are nostalgic about the past and fearful about the future. And I see this kind of as a central problem of the European politics these days, which is not about simply nationalism and federalism. This is not about this clear divide. This is much more about trying to make understanding of the world, which basically you don't have the feeling that you understand anymore. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I think the last thing that you said captures it very well, encapsulates it, the nostalgic about the past and fearful about the future, which has so many dimensions. Thank you also for mentioning the Yugoslav example, my former country, which disappeared in front of my eyes and became 7 countries, and that talks about the dark part of European history. And if I may say from a personal vantage point, we thought then, with all the hope that 1989 appeared, that all that was going wrong was a total exception to the rule. As you said, and as many of us feel, this was a sort of announcement of things that were to come in other parts of Europe, strangely enough, for that moment. Ruth, I know you want to react, but Ivan asked this rhetorical question, which I think I'd like you all to address. Where was nationalism hiding?
Well, if I may start.
Sure, absolutely.
Well, I don't think that nationalism was hiding so strongly in, you were talking about this East-West divide, yeah? And also that the West, of course, also had to change because the East changed, and it was obviously wrong to expect that the West would stay static when the East changes. So
and
there
it's
was
important to underline that.
Yeah, so obviously there was an interdependence. Again, having studied very much of the discourses, and I come from that level much more than from, although you can't neglect the ideologies and the material practices, but this is the entry point for us, is to study the various discourses. If I look at the discourses after '89, but also before, there was nationalism already in Austria very strongly. If you remember 1986, that was a very interesting year in Austria. That was the year of the Waldheim affair, and it was the year of the coup of Haider. And it's interesting that both things happened in the same year, and both were accompanied or also grounded on very nationalistic sentiments. Waldheim was sort of us against them, and the them was the World Jewish Conspiracy and the international media and so forth and so forth. And it was us, Austria, against the world. So it actually had a very strong nationalistic component, and it was, of course, also against the other candidate and so forth. It's a complex issue. We wrote a book at that time, which was actually triggered. Again, I have to point to Minister Buzek, and I still thank him for initiating that project long ago, because it was very, very important to understand a lot about Austria and Central Europe. And we have the anti-Semitism, which has come back with a vengeance now in Hungary, and again, the world conspiracy. So that was here, and that is here again, and that had been here before. Yeah? The second, Haider. I don't want to talk now at length about Haider. There's so much written about him and so forth. But, of course, there was the revisionist past. It was reinventing, rewriting the past, sort of claiming the good SS and so forth, and also Heimat, in a negative, for many of us, negative sense, the German, yeah? So it was not hiding, yeah? It was here. It was triggered by some political events. It was much more tabooed in Germany for many different reasons, which I don't want to go into. But just talking about Austria, it wasn't hidden. And if you look at sort of the threat which goes from the 80s to now, yeah, it's not surprising that we have this renationalizing tendencies. And I was looking at the Salzburger Nachrichten yesterday, and they had on the first page a big caricature. At last the wall has been torn down, and the other person says, "What do you mean? There are new walls going up everywhere. Nothing has changed." Yeah, so it was a very sad caricature and actually speaks to Jacques' book, yeah? A wall was torn down, but new walls are going up everywhere, not to speak about the United States, but, you know, Festung Europa, Fortress Europe has come again. So I don't think nationalism was hiding. It was not hiding in the West. There were moments all around all the time, also in the United Kingdom, which I had lived in. I remember also under the Labour government, very strong, the emphasis on British jobs for British workers. Yeah, so you had by British, yeah. So you had these, you know, banal nationalism in many, many ways. I'm referring now to Mick Billig's. You were talking about the flag. it's not just the flag, it's sports. Nationalism in football, well, of course. Skiing, of course, yeah? So that was always there. Popular culture, of course, yeah? And what we see now in studying this longitudinal development of national and globalized identities is that there is an interdependence between the popular culture and the political culture. Yeah? So we are more and more getting into some kind of hybridized culture, which means televised, celebrity culture, songs, this, that, and the other. And it's what you also mentioned, Constanze, this flow. Yeah? And finally, I would like to say, it's very interesting, especially in looking back at the year 2015, which really triggered nationalistic sentiments. Yeah? So we had the refugee movement and the counter movement of putting up walls, closing borders, closing Schengen, everything which we believed in, which was open, free movement, was suddenly closed down. Yeah? Or there were a lot of proposals to close down. There was this very strange proposal to close down the Mediterranean. I never understood how that should work. How do you put a wall in the sea? But, there were big debates with the Greeks at that time. So this nostalgia, which you were also talking about, there are certain points which it really refers to. Yeah, it's not nowhere. Yeah, it's very clear that there are points which are referred to, and this is just 4 years ago. So I think that 2015 is really a tipping point now in the development. We haven't talked about migration yet. You talked about emigration from the East, yeah? But we also have immigration. Now the big question for me would be, if the Eastern countries are so desperate about losing so many people, they could also gain many people, but they don't want those people. So that's a problem. Yeah? They take in the Ukrainians, but they don't want Muslims. They don't. So it's an obvious religious distinction. Yeah? And for me, it has a lot to do with identity politics, obviously, and actually also identitarian politics. These fears and these ideologies, these sentiments actually come close to fears of replacement. Yeah? And I think this is one of the biggest challenges which we are facing now. Europe, in my view, is a continent of immigration and has always been multicultural, multilingual, not only the Habsburgs. Yeah? And if we should refer back to something, we should actually dig out some of that tradition. Not all was good. I'm not nostalgic now. But it's not like it has never been. And this enormous fear of losing this homogeneous nation state in the East and juxtaposed to the multiculti, yeah, which we have in the West, this divide has to be transcended. And I think this is, apart from the climate crisis, this is really one of the biggest challenges we are facing, where there's so much dehistoricizing going on. And if I may just conclude with the last point, 1945, we all mentioned that. There was the biggest migration movement Europe has ever seen. We just forget that. Yeah. 1945, end of the war, everything was destroyed. Nobody had anything to eat. Yeah? It was terrible. And there were the biggest migration movements, displaced persons, from the camps, from the Sudeten Germans, from these big, moving around. There, in Austria, I think there were, if I'm not wrong, more than 2.5 million migrants, refugees, stuck. And somehow you coped with that in a time where nobody had anything. Now, Austria and Switzerland and Denmark and Norway and so forth, we're the richest countries in the world, and we cannot cope with that. And for me, this is a paradox which is very difficult to understand.
Okay. Ivan, you wanted to react briefly?
Because I do, yeah. I do believe it's very important what you're saying, and I agree with you that migration is going to be critical. Two interesting distinctions. 20th century, after 1945, major movement of people, which resulted in homogenization of societies and not diversities. Mm-hmm. Germans were sent back to Germany. Ukrainians being sent back to Ukraine. For example, if you go in the Bulgarian history, in the 1920s after World War I, Bulgaria had 1/3 of the population have been refugees, people coming from either Turkey, Macedonia, and others, but they have been ethnic Bulgarians. The interesting story is, and this was basically the message of 1918. This was the destruction of the empires, and cultural homogeneity was perceived as a kind of a foundation for security and for democracy. And this was a tradition, I agree very much, there were two traditions. The problem was that this cosmopolitan traditions was also very much mixed with the imperial tradition. And you have this kind of a strange, extremely strange on discursive level situation in which many of the right-wing populists today are trying basically to take the anti-imperialist discourse as their discourse. If you talk to the French far right and you're going to ask who are your heroes, they're going to say, my heroes are the Algerians from the 1960s who expelled 1 million French because they know how to defend their land. And I'm saying this because also I do believe migration is going to happen also in Central and Eastern Europe. And no doubt on this, and this is not simply economy, do you know which is the country in European Union in the last 3 years which welcomed most labor migrants? Poland. There are more than 2 million, basically mostly Ukrainians being in Poland, where I do believe is going to be a difference. And this is a very important difference because it's also going to shape the European Union. The difference is that if you go back to the Western Europe, by the way, nobody talks about open borders anymore. If you go back to Macron from the last week, the major story is how we control the borders. Yeah. And nobody believes that you can close the borders. So even if you're going to make a wall in the Mediterranean, it's going to be an expensive project, somebody can make money out of it, but you're not going to stop people moving. People are moving because George Steiner, whom you quoted, he has this great phrase, he said, trees has roots. People have legs. And from this point of view, people are moving. But there is something very important in the way you decide who is becoming part of your political community. And to be honest, this is what sovereignty is very much about. The problem is who is part of the political community. Mm-hmm. And you cannot tell people you cannot be interested in this. Because the moment when you tell them you cannot be interested who is part of your political community, there is no political community. Mm-hmm. From this point of view by the way, the difference also between East and West is not the major divide in Europe. The major divide is between the urban metropolitan cities and the rural areas, both in the East and in the West. Vienna and Budapest are close in social and cultural attitudes than basically Budapest and some of its countryside, and to be honest, Vienna and some of its countryside. And this, of course, can be seen in the most classical way in Germany. So the difference is going to be that, nevertheless, that we talk about refugees, in a certain way, Central and Eastern Europe is very much interested not in refugees, but in labor migrants. And the idea is we're going to select people much more based on cultural proximity. And thirdly, we can allow people to enter the labor market, but we're going to be very unwilling to give them political rights to vote. So you can end up in a situation in 20 years in which the majority of the people on the labor market were not going to vote, and the majority of the voters are not going to work, being retired people. Yeah. On the case of Western Europe, the strategy is different. Basically, the idea is we are going to try to select the people coming much more based on skills. Everybody now is praising the Canadian and the Australian system. So we want the best educated, we want those who are going to contribute most, and we are going to give them a path to citizenship because we do believe this is the only way to integrate them because we want them to stay. This is going to be biggest divide. And saying from this, from political point of view, from the democratic point of view, we are entering a very strange situation. You remember, after 1953 anti-communist uprising in East Berlin, Brecht has this famous poem called The Solution, in which he said, if the government is so disappointed with the people, probably they should dissolve the people and elect a new one. With this combination between a major demographic decline, loss of population, and the big migration, the governments are going to be able to elect their own people. And this is a kind of a real situation, and these elections are going to work differently in different places. And this is going to be one of the interesting stories that is going to be interesting about Europe, because it's very much you're going to decide to whom to give a citizenship, how big this, and how these people are going to vote, at least how you imagine them they're going to vote, is going to play a critical role. When now people are talking about the Republican Party of the United States, supporting President Trump about walls and so on, I remember 20 years ago, totally different debates in which the Republican strategists are saying, we like the Latino migrants because they're Catholics, they're anti-abortion. At the end of the day, they're going to vote for us. There was the talk about new Republican majority. When this changed when migration became the major dividing line in politics. And I do believe this is type of the story that we're talking about, and I agree very much with Jacques. It's not a classical clash between federalists and sovereignists. I do believe that there are going to be a much more subtle divisions in different societies, in Europe as a whole, because neither federalists believe that they can federalize Europe in the way it is, no sovereignists really believe. Can you imagine Bulgarian sovereignty in the world in which we have? So Bulgaria versus China, India, United States, Russia. So this talk, things that people were right and could be allowed to believe in the 19th century cannot be believed now. And from this point of view, quoting the German President Steinmeier, who said, in Europe there are only two types of states. Small states that they know that they're small, and small states who do not know that they're small.
Can I just go to Constanze? Clearly we've been here before, and you say that the institution that you lead goes back to the 19th century. I have this lovely quote from Heinrich Heine, German Jewish Enlightenment poet, who asked, what is the task of our time? Basically is the question we're asking ourselves here. And he answers in 1828, he says, it is emancipation, not only of the Irish, of the Greeks, of the Frankfurt Jews, of the American blacks, or other equally oppressed populations, but everyone. But above all, it's about the emancipation of Europe. So, as I said, we've been here before, we've been confronted in different historical circumstances with similar questions. How do you react to something like that as people come with their various views to you and to reflect in the museum about themselves? Are there frictions with the way that you present Europe and the visitors that come there?
Yes, there are, of course. First of all, there were frictions in our team because we had to bring together the historians from all across Europe to create this narrative, and that's first to start. Perhaps that I would agree very much with Ruth that national perspectives, perhaps broadening from nationalism to national perspectives or national interests, have been very prominent, and we saw that very practically in our team because all history teaching. Most history teaching in schools and often also at universities is national. So if you bring together historians to write together a European narrative for a museum, or it could be for a book, which some historians have described as being impossible to write a history of Europe, it's very interesting how we had to move out of our national perspectives, learn about the history well, the history about Eastern Europe in Western Europe, for example, is very limited. You have to step out of your comfort zone, and the same is valid for our visitors. We have very, very different reactions. I would say the biggest type of reaction is perhaps this and this and this and this is missing, and that is a very long list, because of course a museum is a selection of processes. So here it's a selection of those processes that have shaped the whole continent. It's not about the EU, it's about the whole continent. And many people miss those things from their national history that they've learned in schools. So the victorious battle or the national hero. So very often it comes from the national perspective. And of course, we don't have space.
Which tells you a lot about how history is taught in schools,
exactly,
right?
how history is taught, how history is being perceived, how history is being remembered, sometimes organically, but also sometimes instrumentalized by current political actors who try to refocus on a certain vision of their own country's history, and who don't like our museum because it's broader than that. And the interesting thing is that the reactions are often contradictory. So we can have a Spanish comment saying that we are much too lenient with Franco, and another one who says we're too critical. So you can see that even the discussion within Spain is mirrored in our museum. The most interesting thing is also that the way we look at history, we have a lot to discuss about, I think. If you look at the tradition of history museums, they are very different across Europe. And for example, in the section about colonialism, where we speak about difficult pasts, some visitors can tell us, well, why don't you just show how great the civilization is that Europe brought to the world, you see? So some people expect a history museum to be just an enumeration of glorious facts from the past. And here we come to what you have said about nostalgia. There is a lot of glorification of the past in school books, in history museums, and we take a critical stance, and we have been criticized for being too German in that. Because one historian from a Central Eastern European country said, your way of looking at history, which looks very much at the dark sides, there's a lot about the wars, about the Holocaust, etc. This was suitable for Germany because of its past, but it's not suitable for many other countries. So you see, depending on the perspective you take, while no one would argue that world wars are part of European history, when you take a more narrow stance and you look at certain processes, you can decline that it's actually part of history. Colonialism is one example as well, which not everybody would agree upon that it's part of their history. So the museum stirs a lot of debate, which I think is useful because it shows the differences of commemorating the difference of history teaching.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Ivan organized a meeting with editors-in-chief of cultural journals from the US and Europe and all parts of Europe. And one of the panels, this was about a month ago, was asking how much should we remember and how much should we forget? Mm-hmm. Of course, a difficult question. How would you answer that question?
We have this dichotomy in our exhibition symbolized in one room by two quotes, one from Churchill from 1946 when he said, I quote, I don't have the exact quote, but roughly, we have to forget to be able to move on. So that was right after World War II. And 40 years later, Elie Wiesel, who said, we have to remember because without memory, there's no hope. But between those two, there are 40 years, and I think that's these are phases in societies when they will answer this question differently, as we see, for example, in Spain. Sometimes it needs a generation to be able to remember in a different, more precise way. And we, of course, as a museum, we would say we have to remember that's part of our reason of being.
Yeah, many of our parents who lived through World War II were prone more to sort of not talk about it rather than to talk about it. Because of what happened to my country, I would rather say the opposite. We need to talk quite a bit about it so that maybe that is a way in which we might avoid, not always foolproof. Jacques, on this issue of, Macron has talked about European sovereignty. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, of course, but we have then to put it in the context in which he's saying this. If Europeans discover that their security is no longer guaranteed automatically by somebody overseas, and I am talking about the Atlantic Alliance and NATO, and first, and if the greatest ally, President of the United States, for the first time, uses the word enemy to talk about the European Union, this sort of brings the message that what you took as automatic, as self-evident for so many decades, no longer is. Then, what I said about our environment, in the East, with reassertive Russia, in the South, with collapsing states and rise of Islamists, you have good reasons to think that nobody will fix it for you. You better start thinking on your feet. So I understand this term, not just as defending European sovereignty in World Trade Organization, which it already does. Okay, this is what Europeans are good at, about trade. Now they have to think about politics. Migration, if you don't want just to build fences, well, you will have to think about the European response to that. If you want to think about security, you have to think about European response. And you can go, enumerate the key issues around which that European response is necessary. And that is politics. And Europe, and even geopolitics. And of course, Europe has been built against that idea of geopolitics. It has been built on containing geopolitics, because geopolitics was understood as leading, geopolitical thinking was just academic preparation for war, or whatever. So you have to maybe reformulate the European project in the name of, in the context of these new circumstances. Okay, one thing is to assert that we need a European response. This is how I understand the call for some kind of European sovereignty, because you can brag about national sovereignty, but the context of it, as Ivan said, and this is true not just for Bulgaria, it is true for most of, even for the bigger states.
Yeah.
So if it's not just rhetoric, then you have to think in European terms. Can you do something like that in the context of our previous discussion, when we are talking about rise of nationalism, about populism, about the political context is not very favorable to such thinking, the general context. I mean, the post-89 cycle was a context of opening borders, bringing down walls, globalization, even sometimes in a naive manner on the part of Europeans. They thought global markets, global promotion of democracy globally, global civil society. Our friend Mary Kaldor, global civil society, global human rights, etc. Everything was global, and it started, Bernard Kouchner. It starts with Médecins Sans Frontières, you start with Doctors Without Borders, and you have this ideology of without borders. Everything is without borders. I was asked by a Finnish colleague if I would join an association of historians without borders. Why not? No, there's nothing wrong with it. But so that was the post-89. That was the post-89 cycle, and that cycle has been pretty much exhausted, and it has been exhausted internally in terms of the liberal democracies and the way they are in crisis today, and it has been exhausted externally. Michael Walzer has a very interesting last book in which he doesn't discuss Europe at all, and he's comparing India, Algeria, and Israel. And he says basically that you had, for about 25 years, modernizing secular elites that were helping to build these states, transforming them into modern, open societies. And after these 25 years, you have a different cycle. They are all swept away by nativist, conservative, religiously minded, etc. So he's talking not about Europe, but that cycle that brought Brexit and Trump, and I could continue the list, puts us in a different context. So when Macron is proposing that we should now think as Europeans, we should pool sovereignty, not just for trade, But for politics, we have to think Europe in political terms. That is a very tall order in the context in which everybody is bragging about protecting the nation, building the wall, protecting sovereignty, protecting identity, back to what I started with. So the political cycle that we are engaged with is not terribly favorable to that. But sometimes, when you are confronted with necessity, you may have to change your mind and you may take some steps. You know, there's nothing like being told you're going to be executed tomorrow to concentrate the minds. So I'm not saying that an external threat is enough to bring us together and share sovereignty. We need a positive project, of course. But the positive project is to preserve and develop what we have achieved. This is a unique achievement, the European project, you know, built on democracy, human rights, rule of law, and peace in Europe. You don't sustain it by rhetoric, you sustain it by showing it is relevant for the challenge that we are facing today. This is, I understand, what Macron is doing. Is he going the right way about it? I'm not always sure. I have my reservations, but that is not for our debate today. But that is certainly a question that is at least asked to all Europeans. I think all of us can, in our different contexts, confront this question.
I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head with your remarks. We are excellent, we Europeans, if I dare say, are excellent at self-deprecation, self-criticism. You know, the challenges are enormous, and yet Europe is still the goal of all these people who have legs and are walking towards Europe and want to live in this model. However imperfect it is for us, it is still the least bad model of all. You know, rights, you can speak freely. Yeah, maybe it's tough to find a job, but at least you can search one. And, you know, create the semblance of having some sense of normality. People do not go to China or to India or to Russia or wherever. They come here and to the West in generally. I say that because there's this other thing. All opinion polls show, when asked the very general question, you know, do you think Europe is good for you? Practically in all countries, okay, Italy and Greece have had a little problems, but they have results of around 70 to 75, anywhere between 65 and 70%. So that means that even these people that we've been talking about all together feel, and this is my interpretation, but I stand corrected and I'd like to hear your opinion. Why is it that these people feel this? I think it's because they think there is some kind of garde-fou in French. There's a firewall in Brussels that if our leaders go crazy, somebody will be there to stop them before they go over the cliff. And I think that is what Europe is giving, whatever the Brussels bashing is going on. Obviously, Great Britain we can discuss, but for the rest of us, I think there is this sentiment that these institutions are democratic writ large, and that they will defend us, come what may, in a dramatic historical situation. We have about 8 to 10 minutes left, and I'd like to ask you for a final round. Maybe reflect on those thoughts and add anything else. Let me start with Ivan.
I'll go just for what you said, because if you go on the polls, you're going to see something very interesting. Support for the EU was never higher since 1970s than now, but in all countries that the European Council on Foreign Relations have been polling, with the exception of Spain, the majority of the people said that they are not sure that European Union is going to be around in 10 or 15 years.
Why do you think that is, Ivan?
And this is, in a certain way, support also comes from the fear that there is something that we can lose. And this is an important story, because I totally agree with you. And by the way, this was also one of the reasons why people easily vote for populists, because you said, listen, I'm voting for them to say a signal. But I'm not afraid that they're going to do something really awful, because Brussels is not going to allow them to do it. But at the same time, the constraint coming from Brussels is very positive if you believe that status quo works. The fear is that basically Brussels is now becoming also a constraint for change that should happen. And this is where Macron comes, because his intuition, I agree very much with you, I do believe he has, if Europe has a kind of a deficit of vision, Macron has an excess of visions. You cannot have a vision every week. But from this point of view, his basic story is the status quo is not there anymore, you need disruption. The world is changing dramatically. European Union is going to be the bigger loser of a world which is very much reorganized on a zero-sum political games. And we should be able to do something. We should be turned into an actor and not simply a spectator of a global politics. And from this point of view, some of the constraints that worked for you well yesterday, not allowing you to do something stupid, now can become a constraint that prevent you to do anything. And this kind of a fear of paralysis, that we cannot do anything, neither good nor bad, that basically we're staying with the status quo. I do believe this is kind of a coming, and from this point of view, it's interesting to see the strengths of some of the green and environmental movements, because they have one major difference between these movements and, for example, the anti-nuclear movements that in Western Europe was also quite massive and positive. The anti-nuclear movements were saying to the governments, don't do something, don't use the bomb. Here the message is do something different. Not doing something is not enough. And from this point of view, if Europe is not going to show capacity of doing something and not simply preventing people to do stupid things, in 5 or 10 years, we're going to see this period as a wasted time. And we are going basically to be blamed by the next generations for what we are not doing today.
Ruth.
Of course, I totally agree with you, and I think that the new social movements are really the point to build on. Fridays for Future, all the new generation, which is finally doing something. I would just like to point to one issue which we haven't addressed, and that is social Europe. I think that the social inequality, which we haven't talked about, is an enormous challenge. And of course, it's connected to migration and the climate crisis. So all of these things are connected, which makes it so difficult. But as long as the young generation has, and we as parents have the feeling that we cannot give them a better future than we had, which is one thing parents always want to do, is guarantee that the children will have a better future. This is bad. And of course, there's the fear that we will be losing something, which explains why the far-right populist movements are so strong in countries which are so rich. Yeah, they are not always connected to financial crisis or economic crisis, quite in contrast. They're in the countries where everything is very nice, Norway or Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, because of the fear of losing something. And this is where politics should finally override economics again, yeah? Because we have to guarantee a social Europe. And if we cannot guarantee, not we as academics will not do that, but if politics doesn't strive again to guarantee a social Europe, which is also one of the constitutive elements of the European Union, this fear will grow and it will again nurture extremist movements. So, which are connected, as I said, with migration and other challenges. And this is where you talked about solidarity, where these old notions come in again. And I don't know how to achieve that. But due to the enormous global challenges, also transnational solidarity has to be possible again. Mm. And if that's not possible, if that is thrown back only on the nation state, which obviously cannot deal with the global challenges, I think the crisis will be quite big. So I'm pleading very much for a new way of dealing with all these challenges, which include the vision again of a social Europe.
Ruth, thank you very much for bringing that forward, because I was asked, Judy Dempsey, our colleague, asked this question regularly, and she asked about new walls going up, and in a very brief answer I wrote that I thought that the wall of the unequal between the 1% and those who are there is, for me, one of the biggest walls that has gone up, and one that actually defines many of the challenges that we face going forward. So, and also to your fact that we are academics. No, we are people who have a voice. And you know, the Indignados, one of the movements in Spain said, we have a vote, but we don't have a voice, meaning our vote really can't change things. Well, maybe, you know, by speaking a little louder, we can. Constanze, to this question about Europe actually having, being a model and being a reference for others, are we in a situation in which we are on the Titanic and rearranging the deck chairs?
Difficult question. I think we forget exactly what has been said, that we were an emigration continent in the late 19th, early 20th century. 50 million Europeans left. Now we are the glorious land where people want to move. I think we forget this positive aspect. And what I'm sometimes worried about is that history shows that the way Europe was built, because Europe is no pre-existing entity, it's not even clear where it ends, and etc. But the way it evolves is very much shaped also by the image that Europeans create. And there's an influence between the imagination of what it should be or what it could be and the reality that is being created. We see that in different phases, like in the resistance movements or in even under National Socialism, that there was a certain vision of Europe. So where are the visions today? I agree that it's not nice to have one every day, but where are courageous visions? We have been hearing a lot about fear, and this is a general trend, the fear of losing things, and populist parties play with this fear. But where is the courage? I'm missing courage. Where is the courage? Courageous visions of which, in previous centuries, even European Union was proposed, or in the interwar period, Pan-European Union was proposed. Where are these visions today in the political sphere? Who has the courage to have a clear vision of Europe, which entails perhaps losing national competence? Because I agree with the necessity of social Europe, but national governments don't want to lose their say over these matters, so they don't want to hand over competency to Brussels. So where is the courage to reduce one's own power at the expense of creating something together, and to be proud of what has been achieved in Brussels, to say we achieved this as opposed to I achieved this for my country against Brussels or against the others. So I'm just pleading for a bit more courage to develop visions and to implement them, even if it means that your own power might be reduced.
Jacques, last but not least, the final word goes to you, but geopolitics has knocked on Europe's doors, as you sort of mentioned in your last response. Our colleague and friend Mark Leonard wrote a book more than 10 years ago, "The EU Will Run the World" or "Rule the World." Well, clearly that has not happened. Do you think, and you know, this has been used as a cliche, will Europe become the Venice of the world? Is this the place where people will come to see how La Serenissima, how wonderful it was to be in a powerful imperial seafaring nation, and the world will be ruled by China and US and others?
With the rising water levels.
With the rising water.
Yeah, that's it's quite cruel to remember Mark Leonard's book, How Europe Will Run the 21st Century. let's be more modest, but we are in front of this dilemma today. Are we going to be actors facing these challenges? Are we going to be more in passive mode? Passive mode has been the usual way of getting by. I mean, Europeans are great at it. I mean,
is there capacity for leadership? I mean,
is there capacity for leadership? Well, the problem is leadership cannot be self-proclaimed. You know, I rather like a number of the proposals Macron is making. The problem is
there's no one behind him.
There's nobody. So this is it. You know, leadership. You have to build patiently political alliances and coalition. That is, I think, very, very difficult. But we are at this dilemma. Either we accept that Europe has to basically redefine its initial purpose, which was against geopolitics, and has to think of itself as a geopolitical actor because of the number of the things we have talked about that cannot be dealt with by individual states, and because nobody else will fix them for us. Or, of course, the other option, which has quite a few supporters, is, you know, Europe, I don't know whether it's compared to Venice, or Europe as a greater Switzerland. Small, prosperous, secluded, quiet, and this is exit from history. Europeans accepting, you know, eclipse from history. Some might be tempted by that. The hedonistic, postmodern, individualistic consumer lifestyle. A number of our constituencies in individual states would probably go for that. And,
but the difference is that Switzerland is surrounded by Europe,
yes,
which we would not be.
Exactly. So no, this cannot do anymore. And the people who nowadays oppose national interest and European interest are really not getting this point. And I hear this rhetoric everywhere, I mean, including in Prague, where I'm heading this evening. This is everywhere. And when I hear that, I feel like reminding them of what Belgian Prime Minister Paul-Henri Spaak. This is a story told to me by Philippe Descoutet, who's a great constitutional lawyer and who was his advisor. And he said that before every European meeting, they would have a preparation, little council, you know, advisors would come. And so the guy would say, okay, on the next, this was still the small Europe of the six, okay. The next agenda, you know, this and this issue will come. Now, the Germans will want this, the French will want that, this and that, and our interest is to develop this. And second issue on the agenda is this and that. Italians would want this, the Dutch would want that. You know, our proposal is to do that. And then third issue, and he says this and that. And before he said our interest, he was interrupted by Paul-Henri Spaak, who said, our interest is that que ce machin marche. Our interest is that this thing works. This thing is not a very elegant way to describe the European project, but clearly understood, that the well understood self-interest, particularly of small nations, but not only of them, is that this thing works. Now, people say, well, this is a very prosaic vision. You need vision. You need a European dream. How come you don't have a European dream? To that I answer, we don't have a European dream, but the great thing about the European project is that it makes variety of European dreams work together. For each of our nations had projected onto Europe its own aspiration, its own dream, its own national dream, if you want, the national interest. So for the Germans, it was rehabilitation after the war. For the French, it was a new role as a power in the post-war situation. For the Italians, it was compensating the weakness of the nation state. Spain and Portugal, it was a post-dictatorship travel to democracy. For Czechs and Slovaks, it is a kind of new umbrella after their divorce. And I could go on, but you got the point. We have a multitude of European dreams, and the great thing about the European project is to make the different European dreams compatible, to make them work together. And if you combine that idea, that you have the compatibility of our European dreams and that we are facing a common challenge, well, then, you know, we need political leadership to steer us in that direction. Otherwise, we will be, as you said, the spectators, Swiss, Venetian, choose your preference.
Okay. Well, I will conclude extremely briefly by saying that, if I may interpret it in that way, that we are in fact living the European dream in all the reality of life, in the fact that we do live the consequences of the Enlightenment, that reason somehow finds its way to prevail against all the headwinds of populism, identitarianism, the fact that Zuzana Čaputova won the election in Bratislava in Slovakia, the fact that in the European elections still the pro-European forces have won, not to mention the victory of Van der Bellen here in Austria. Things are complicated, there are many vectors, and the model is maintained. I think the biggest challenge, as you said, and as we have all said, will be the internal ones on the homogenization of ethnicity and how we go about that and how it's put in together with other European nations, which you rightly mentioned. But again, the fact that Europeans, when asked this very broad question, if I can say so, believe in Europe, gives some kind of hope that we will be able to make this thing work, as you said. Please join me in thanking the panelists, and thank you all for coming.